Shutter speed is one of the single most important settings when it comes to creating videos. What's shakin' bacon? I'm Joni Simon, food photographer, video creator. Welcome to my studio. This is part 6 in a 9-part series on creating professional videos. So whether you're a food photographer who wants to add video to your list of skills or a content creator looking to take things up a level, this mini course covers all those essential concepts for building your knowledge. This also serves as the introductory unit for my Food in Motion course, a comprehensive experience for food photographers who want to learn to create captivating videos. I've got more details about that linked down below. So now let's talk about shutter speed. What do we already know that shutter speed impacts in still photography? Well, exposure for one thing, which we're going to talk more about soon, but it also impacts the appearance of movement, right? A faster shutter speed will freeze action. A slower shutter speed can capture motion blur. And it does the same in video. A faster shutter speed will provide crisper footage. A slower shutter speed will create more motion blur. And like we talked about in the discussion of frame rates, some motion blur in your footage feels true to life and appears more cinematic, where crisper footage can feel more hyper-realistic and, to my eye, kind of activating. So there is no right or wrong in wanting something cinematic versus something hyper-realistic. That's your creative choice. But because of our frame rate, there are limits and best practices to follow with your shutter speed when capturing video. And this is what we call the 180-degree shutter rule. The 180-degree shutter rule says that your shutter speed should be set such that the bottom number is double your selected frame rate. So if you select a frame rate of 24 frames per second, you would then dial in a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. If your frame rate is 60 frames per second, you'd want a shutter speed of, any guesses? 1/120th of a second. This helps to ensure smooth, natural-looking footage at the frame rate that you're using. And we can see that with these two clips captured at 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second following the 180-degree rule. Now, there are compelling creative and technical reasons, though, to manipulate the shutter speed faster or slower than what's dictated by the 180-degree shutter rule. But as you're getting started, this is a solid best practice. You have to master the rules before you can break them. But now, of course, shutter speed also impacts the exposure. The slower your shutter speed is, the brighter your exposure. The faster your shutter speed, the darker your exposure will become. But now let's run a little experiment together. Don't worry about setting up a scene. Just wherever you are, get out your camera, put the camera into video mode, make sure you're in manual mode. Select a frame rate of 30 frames per second, or close to that depending on your camera, and then set your shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. The bottom number, again, is double your frame rate. So then next, let's select an aperture, let's say f5 or somewhere around there, and then ISO 100. And then let's look at your exposure. How does it look? Is it too bright because you're in a super bright and sunny location and things are super blown out? Or is it nighttime and you've just got a few room lights on and so your exposure is super dark? Well, if we were shooting still photography, what setting would you change to alter the exposure? I know for me, in either case, whether it's too bright or too dark, and assuming I'm not working with my artificial lighting, my go-to would be to change the shutter speed. Because maybe stylistically, I really like the aperture of f5, the bokeh it creates, and I try not to touch my ISO in order to keep the image crisp with minimal noise. But in this case, our shutter speed is essentially locked in because of the 180-degree shutter rule. So moving into video, be prepared to make that shift toward utilizing your aperture and your ISO instead of shutter speed to compensate for exposure. Now, of course, if you're a fan of Flash like me, you might already be used to that, because in the world of Flash, we're typically shooting at very similar shutter speeds, usually our sync speed, but that's a whole other discussion, a whole other rabbit hole. I will link information about that rabbit trail down below if you want to run in that direction. But if we can stay focused here in the video world, let's go ahead and take things a step further. Let's just say in this experiment that your exposure turned out super dark and you're at the widest aperture for the lens that you're using, right? You have got it wide open, so like you're at f2.8, f1.8, and you've increased your ISO as high as you're comfortable taking it before the grain becomes too much and you don't have any other lighting to add to the scene. Well, what can you do? Well, you certainly can slow your shutter speed if you like, but bear in mind it will introduce a bit more blur to your footage. So you can see a side by side here. Both clips were filmed at 60 frames per second, but the one on the left was using a shutter speed of 1/120th of a second, following the 180-degree shutter rule, and the other one on the right was set to 1/60th of a second. So can you spot the difference? Well, as you can see, there is a touch more motion blur in the 1/60th of a second shutter speed footage. It still works. That said, you never want to set your shutter speed's bottom number lower than your frame rate, because then that will result in choppy, jerky footage. The shutter is just not fast enough to keep up with the frame rate capture. Now, you might have a camera like some of mine that don't actually allow you to select a shutter speed below your frame rate limit. So that definitely helps prevent that error. But now let's say for the experiment we ran, instead of your image being overexposed at 1/60th of a second, f5, ISO 100, maybe you're outside where you can't control the sun. Your ISO is as low as it can go, and perhaps you want a wider aperture for some nice bokeh in the scene. So what can you do? Well, you can, first of all, add a neutral density filter, an ND filter, which is effectively like putting sunglasses on your lens to darken the exposure. But if you don't have one of those, you can increase your shutter speed. But again, it will impact the look of your footage. It's a bit more stylized, again, more like that hyper-realistic feel. You can see again here a side by side. These were both captured at 60 frames per second frame rate, the left at 1/120th of a second shutter speed, following the 180-degree shutter rule. And then the one on the right was at 1/240th of a second, double the 180-degree shutter rule. And so what do you see in comparing these two pieces of footage? Is one more appealing to you than the other? I'd love for you to share your thoughts down in the comments below. Now, what is so fascinating here? We'll see if the comments in this video reflect this, but invariably you will find that half the people will prefer more motion blur, half the people will go for the more crisper, hyper-realistic feel. The truth is there's really no right or wrong. It's just a matter of personal choice. Now, perhaps you're limited based on the environment you're shooting in, or the tools that you have, or maybe you just like the way the footage looks one way versus the other. Or maybe the story you're telling in the video calls for something activating and over the top, and a faster shutter speed is more fitting versus a slower cinematic sequence that you want to look smooth and buttery. But what's most important is that you're aware of the options available to you and that you feel empowered to make those creative decisions. But so now that we have switched into video mode, you have your frame rate, your resolution dialed, you understand the 180-degree shutter rule, you have your shutter speed set. Let's now move into the next lesson, lesson number 7, answering the age-old question, how do I know if my exposure is bright or dark enough?